The story behind the Jewish phenomenon. A question that changed everything. Picture Steven Silbiger sitting in his marketing executive's office at the turn of the millennium, surrounded by the trappings of success he'd worked so hard to achieve. But something nagged at him, a question that wouldn't let go. Why did so many of his colleagues, mentors, and competitors share his Jewish heritage? Why did Jewish Americans, making up barely 2% of the population, seem to occupy such disproportionate space in boardrooms, law firms, medical practices, and entertainment studios?
It wasn't a comfortable question to ask. Throughout history, noticing Jewish success had often been the opening chapter in much darker stories that ended in accusations, expulsions, and worse. Anti-Semitic conspiracy theories had weaponized Jewish achievement for centuries, twisting success into sinister narratives about secret cabals and world domination. Silbiger knew the dangers of his inquiry, but he also believed that silence wasn't the answer. Perhaps, he thought, the real antidote to conspiracy theories wasn't to deny the phenomenon, but to explain it. Not through dark fantasies about inherent superiority or shadowy networks, but through an honest examination of culture, values, and practices that anyone could understand and, importantly, adopt.
This conviction led Silbiger to write The Jewish Phenomenon: 7 Keys to the Enduring Wealth of a People, published in 2000. It was a gamble. A Jewish insider attempting to decode his own culture's success for a broader audience, walking the tightrope between celebration and sensitivity, between pride and prudence. The Scholar's Table.
To understand Silbiger's first key, imagine a scene repeated in Jewish homes for thousands of years, a family gathered around a table, but not merely for a meal. Here, even the youngest children are expected to engage with ideas, to question, to debate. A father asks his 8-year-old son what he thinks about a passage from their studies. The child hesitates, then offers an interpretation. Rather than dismissing it, the father considers it seriously, perhaps challenges it, encourages the boy to defend his reasoning.
This wasn't dinner-table small talk. This was intellectual training that began almost from birth and never really ended. Silbiger traced this emphasis on education back through millennia of Jewish history. Long before Harvard or Yale existed, Jewish communities were maintaining systems of near-universal literacy. When most of medieval Europe couldn't read, Jewish communities required every boy to study text and interpretation. This wasn't just religious indoctrination. It was rigorous intellectual training in analysis, argument, and critical thinking.
But here's where the story gets interesting for modern readers. This ancient emphasis on learning perfectly positioned Jewish communities for the knowledge economy that would emerge centuries later. When universities opened their doors wider in the 20th century, Jewish families didn't need to be convinced that higher education mattered. They'd believed it for 3,000 years. When other immigrant groups saw college as a luxury, Jewish families saw it as essential, scraping together resources to send their children to school, even when it meant tremendous sacrifice.
Silbiger tells the story of Jewish mothers working multiple jobs, of families going without so their children could study, of communities pooling resources to support promising students. Education wasn't just valued, it was sacred, non-negotiable, the one inheritance that could never be taken away. And in 20th century America, where intellectual capital increasingly drove success, this cultural inheritance paid extraordinary dividends. The network effect.
The second key emerges from a darker chapter of Jewish history, but one that produced unexpected resilience. Picture 19th century Europe, where Jews faced systematic exclusion from guilds, universities, land ownership, and countless professions. They couldn't simply apply for jobs through normal channels because those channels were closed to them. So they built something else: dense, sophisticated networks of mutual support and opportunity. These weren't shadowy conspiracies, they were practical survival mechanisms. When mainstream banks wouldn't lend to Jewish entrepreneurs, Jewish lending societies emerged. When professional associations excluded Jews, Jewish professional networks formed. When hiring discrimination was rampant, Jewish business people hired other Jews, not primarily from ethnic solidarity, but from practical necessity.
Silbiger argues that this history of exclusion, painful as it was, created something valuable: communities that had perfected the art of mutual support and information sharing. A Jewish businessman in New York might have cousins, former classmates, or community connections in Chicago, Los Angeles, or Europe. Information flowed through these networks about opportunities, about people, about market conditions. Trust, built through shared community and culture, reduced transaction costs and enabled collaboration.
The irony isn't lost on Silbiger. The very discrimination that was meant to limit Jewish success inadvertently created adaptive structures that, once legal barriers fell, became tremendous competitive advantages. Those dense networks became pipelines for opportunity, mentorship, and capital.
The dinner table continued. But let's return to that dinner table, because Silbiger's third key lives there too. Jewish families weren't just teaching intellectual skills, they were transferring something more fundamental: ambition, expectation, and support.
Imagine the message a Jewish child absorbed growing up. You are expected to succeed. Your parents sacrificed for you. Your grandparents survived persecution for you. You carry forward not just a name, but a heritage, and you have a family that will support you, challenge you, celebrate you, and catch you if you fall.
This wasn't pressure for its own sake. Though Silbiger acknowledges it, sometimes felt that way to the children experiencing it. It was a comprehensive system of human development that combined high expectations with real support. Jewish parents attended every school play, every parent-teacher conference. They hired tutors when needed. They made their children practice instruments, pushed them toward professional careers, and maintained multi-generational households where grandparents helped raise achievement-oriented grandchildren.
Silbiger tells the story of Jewish family businesses not just as economic units, but as institutions for transmitting values and skills across generations. A boy working in his father's shop wasn't just earning pocket money, he was absorbing business acumen, customer service, negotiation, and work ethic through osmosis. The family structure created what modern educators might call situated learning, practical education embedded in real-world contexts.
The merchant's mindset. The fourth key requires understanding a fundamental cultural difference in how various traditions view money and commerce. Many religious traditions historically viewed merchants with suspicion. Commerce was tainted, wealth was corrupting, and the truly virtuous sought poverty, or at least material simplicity.
Jewish tradition took a different path. Silbiger explains that while Jewish law certainly warned against the dangers of wealth and emphasized charity and justice, it didn't view business success as inherently sinful. A successful merchant who dealt fairly, supported his community, and gave generously to charity was respected, not suspected.
This cultural comfort with commerce had practical roots. Excluded from land ownership in much of Europe, barred from many professions, Jews channeled their talents into the fields available to them, often trade and finance. What began as necessity became expertise, and expertise became cultural knowledge passed down through generations.
But Silbiger argues there was something deeper, too, a fundamental pragmatism about money as a tool for security and family support. In communities that had experienced repeated expulsions and persecutions, Portable wealth and marketable skills weren't luxuries, they were survival tools. You couldn't take land with you when you were forced to flee, but you could take skills, relationships, and portable assets.
This historical experience created a culture that understood financial literacy, that taught children about money and business from young ages, and that viewed entrepreneurship not as a risky departure from safe employment, but as a path to security and autonomy. The mentor and the mentee.
Silbiger's fifth key tells stories of mentorship, of successful lawyers taking young Jewish attorneys under their wings, of established business people introducing newcomers to crucial contacts, of senior professionals teaching junior ones the unwritten rules of success.
This wasn't simply ethnic favoritism, though critics might see it that way. Silbiger argues it was something more nuanced, successful people investing in their community's human capital, creating pipelines of talent, and honoring an expectation that those who had succeeded had obligations to those coming behind them. Picture a young Jewish graduate arriving in New York or Los Angeles in the mid-20th century, carrying ambition and education but lacking connections. Through family friends, community connections, or professional organizations, he finds his way to someone established who agrees to meet with him. That meeting leads to advice, which leads to an introduction, which leads to an opportunity. The young graduate succeeds, and years later, when another ambitious young person reaches out to him, he remembers who helped him and pays it forward.
This system of mentorship and mutual support created what modern business theorists might call an efficient talent development pipeline. It wasn't guaranteed. Plenty of Jewish young people struggled and failed, but it increased the odds of success for those with talent and determination.
The art of adaptation. The sixth key emerges from one of history's most remarkable survival stories. Jewish communities maintained distinct religious and cultural identity while living as minorities in dozens of different societies across thousands of years. They learned languages, adapted to local customs, succeeded in local economies, all while preserving core identity and traditions.
Silbiger sees this historical experience as creating extraordinary cultural flexibility. Jewish immigrants to America learned English rapidly, changed their names when necessary, adopted American customs, but also maintained synagogues, celebrated holidays, and passed traditions to their children. They were simultaneously insiders and outsiders, Americans and Jews, integrated and distinct. This balance required constant negotiation and adjustment. What could be adapted? What must be preserved? Jewish communities wrestled with these questions in every generation, and Silbiger argues this practice of thoughtful adaptation created valuable skills. Jewish business people became adept at reading new markets, understanding different cultural contexts, and adapting their approaches while maintaining their values.
The balance wasn't always easy or successful. Some lost their identity through over-assimilation. Others isolated themselves and missed opportunities. But the communities that managed the balance well developed what might be called cultural ambidexterity, the ability to operate effectively in multiple cultural contexts simultaneously. The calculated leap.
Silbiger's seventh key explores the relationship between risk and security. On the surface, it seems paradoxical. A culture shaped by insecurity produced people comfortable taking risks. But Silbiger argues the logic becomes clear when you understand Jewish historical experience.
Without access to traditional paths to security, aristocratic privilege, guaranteed positions, hereditary land, Jewish individuals couldn't rely on institutional stability. They needed to create their own security through entrepreneurship and skill. This historical necessity created cultural comfort with self-employment and business creation.
Moreover, Silbiger suggests that experiencing historical persecution created a certain fatalism about security. If you could lose everything to a pogrom or expulsion, regardless of how carefully you played it safe, why not take calculated risks that might dramatically improve your position? If security was always somewhat illusory anyway, you might as well pursue opportunity aggressively.
This manifested in high rates of business formation, willingness to enter new industries, and comfort with career uncertainty. Jewish Americans disproportionately became entrepreneurs, launched startups, and entered emerging fields. They were overrepresented not just in established professions but in new ones: early Hollywood, early television, new technologies, emerging financial instruments. The complications.
But Silbiger's story isn't all triumph and celebration. He acknowledges the complications and criticisms his framework faces. The book walks through difficult territory where any misstep could reinforce harmful stereotypes or oversimplify complex realities.
First, there's the problem of oversimplification. Reducing Jewish American success to 7 keys inevitably flattens a much more complex story involving immigration timing, urban settlement patterns, changing economic structures, particular historical moments, and pure contingency. Jewish immigrants arriving in American cities just as those cities were experiencing explosive growth, just as industries like garment manufacturing and entertainment were emerging, benefited from fortunate timing as much as cultural values. Second, there's the causation question. Yes, Jewish culture emphasizes education, and yes, Jewish Americans are disproportionately successful. But proving the direct causal link requires more rigorous analysis than storytelling provides. Maybe selective immigration patterns matter more than cultural values. Perhaps the Jews who chose to immigrate to America were already more ambitious, educated, or entrepreneurial than those who stayed behind.
Third, there's the uncomfortable reality that discussing Jewish success, even positively, can feed anti-Semitic narratives. Silbiger tries to counter this by emphasizing replicable practices over innate traits, but he knows that anti-Semites have always twisted Jewish achievement into conspiracy theories. By highlighting disproportionate success, even to explain it, does he inadvertently provide ammunition to those with darker agendas?
Fourth, there's the temporal problem. Silbiger's book captures a particular moment in Jewish American history, one that may already be changing. As intermarriage rates exceed 50% and many Jewish Americans become increasingly secular and assimilated, the distinct cultural practices he describes may be eroding. The success patterns he documents might reflect specific historical circumstances rather than timeless cultural truths. The broader conversation.
Yet, despite these limitations, Silbiger's story raises questions that extend far beyond Jewish American experience. If culture significantly influences economic outcomes, and most social scientists would agree it does, what does that mean for policy, for education, for how we think about inequality?
Can cultural values be taught or transferred? Should they be? When we observe different outcomes among different groups, how much can be attributed to culture versus opportunity, discrimination, historical circumstances, or institutional factors? And how do we have these conversations without slipping into cultural determinism or ethnic stereotyping? Silbiger's answer is essentially optimistic. By identifying specific, concrete practices rather than vague cultural traits, he suggests that success principles can be adopted regardless of background. A non-Jewish family can emphasize education. Any community can build support networks. Anyone can adopt positive attitudes toward entrepreneurship. The legacy.
Nearly 25 years after publication, the Jewish phenomenon remains part of ongoing conversations about culture, achievement, and success. Its 7-key framework has influenced how educators, business leaders, and policymakers think about what drives success. Its emphasis on replicable practices provides a constructive approach to discussing sensitive topics about group differences in outcomes.
The book's ultimate contribution may be less about providing definitive answers than about opening important conversations. It invites readers to think seriously about how culture shapes opportunity and achievement. It challenges both Jewish and non-Jewish readers, Jews to consider which traditions are worth preserving, non-Jews to examine which practices might benefit their own communities. For readers preparing to engage deeply with this text, understanding Silbiger's journey, from that initial uncomfortable question to a comprehensive framework for understanding success, provides essential context. His book isn't just analysis, it's an act of cultural translation, an attempt to make visible the often invisible practices and values that shape outcomes. Whether one fully accepts his framework or not, his effort to explain rather than mystify, to demystify rather than obscure, represents a valuable contribution to our understanding of how culture, history, and individual choice intersect to create the patterns of success we observe in the world around us.